Hello, room. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Marie Whittaker. I am really excited to be here. I've already learned so much this weekend, and I'm excited to be able to hopefully impart a little lessons learned from my little corner of the universe, too. If you can't hear me at any point, please just raise your hand and tell me to pump up the volume, because I know that I can talk quietly sometimes. I'll try to keep the mic really, really close to my mouth. Is that good? I'm going to talk about data dashboards made from open data and Python web scraping, using Python for that purpose. And actually, I think I'm really fortunate to have followed our keynote speakers this morning, because my talk is going to be a little bit of an extension of Star's talk about making open data more usable for people and making it more of a public utility. And then a little bit from the earlier speaker's talk about, I really liked that slide with the percentage breakdown of data analysis versus storytelling, because in my job I have to do all of those things, because there's only one of me that's doing data work. Actually two now, we've just hired someone, but I work in the government, so data science is not something that typically has been a focus of hiring. So that's my context. A bit more about me. I studied economics, so that's the background I come from. That's really the data that I'm most familiar with. I didn't really have a lick of experience coding at all with anything but Stata about 1.5 years ago, so I'm kind of new to Python, new to everything here. But I've been working with economic data for a long time. Macro data, broad indicators, survey data, financial institution data, using Census American Community Survey data. And I used to work at the CFPB trying to put together data resources to monitor risks in the mortgage market so that we could avoid the government kind of being caught blindsided by what happened a decade ago when the housing bubble burst. And now I work for the DC government in the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, which fortunately has an acronym because that is too many syllables to say on a regular basis. It's DEMPED, right up here. And what we do there, or what I do there, is I monitor the economy of DC for warning signs and for like looking at good stuff, like what can we be proud of in our city too. So using open data and other data sources to kind of build a narrative of what's going on in DC economically. So all that is to say, I'll go back here, all that is to say that that's kind of the use case that I have, but I think that what I'm going to talk about here is going to hopefully be broadly applicable to other use cases as well. For policy, in the policy world, like a lot of people are really obsessed right now with being data-driven. But what does that actually mean in practice, and why is data a key ingredient here? I think probably you all have like a million different reasons that you could say, but for me, I think it's important to convey the reality of the data world when data is competing with a lot of other things in the minds of policymakers and decision makers. So one of the examples I really love is, how many days has it been since you saw an article on millennials? For me, it's probably less than 24 hours whenever you ask me that. And they kind of contradict themselves. Like, millennials are moving to cities, they love cities, they like flexible work hours, they like small kitchens, apparently, according to one article. You know, like there's so many different articles based on maybe 5 people's experiences or interviews with 2 people. And everyone wants to get in front of what are millennials' preferences. So this is actually an issue, because if in my office we're trying to plan for the next 20 years of what DC will look like, and if you're trying to design a city, design services to a group of people that you think are taking over the city and have vastly different preferences than you do, then that's going to change your decisions about what you want the city to look like. But in reality, actually, and I think this is a great example of data journalism, in reality, the millennials moving to cities phenomenon is one that's really restricted to college-educated people in this age bracket. And actually, rural and suburban areas are more popular for populations of millennials currently. And this data is a little old, but the same conclusions carry through. And in DC, we're trying to do a little quick hit data journalism too to counteract those pieces of anecdotal evidence that policymakers have to filter through their brains. And actually in DC, the age group of 20 to 34-year-olds, yeah, the population's growing, but it's growing at a slower rate than it was a few years ago, and at a slower rate than the adult population is growing in DC. So maybe looking into that more will give us a better idea of, all right, what's actually happening here, and how should we really be designing the city, and what should our priorities be? So for me, data is really an antidote to the anecdotes, and a balance, not a counter argument, but at least a balance to qualitative evidence. And a dashboard, I think, is one answer for getting data into the hands of people who need it regularly, and to build a story and a narrative around what the data is actually saying. I almost named this presentation "Stop Making Dashboards," because I do understand that they are overused and overhyped, but I'll walk through, I think, the principles that make a dashboard appropriate and useful. I just do want to poll the room quickly. How many of you all have made what you would call a data dashboard? Okay, that's a lot. Cool. You should have gone to a different presentation. You know everything already. How many of you regularly use a data dashboard that someone else made? 2. Cool. I'm sorry, everyone else. No one's using your dashboards. And that's what I found too, honestly. I'll get to that a bit later though. So running through those principles that I've kind of distilled from my experience with them. Number 1, consistency in a dashboard. I think the purpose, at least for me, of making dashboards, of having a group of data visualizations next to each other, is to look at the changes and comparisons over time, because I'm updating them frequently. And to look at changes, you need to be able to notice between day 1 and day 2 what has changed in the data, right? And if you have a changing format, an inconsistent style, it's harder to see those changes. There's more cognitive load in the beginning. Like, what am I looking at? It distracts from what's changing. I would also advocate only trying to show one conclusion at a time in each building block of your dashboard. I think you can achieve a certain degree of useful complexity within the whole page, let's say, but if you have a few visualizations on a page, just show one thing in each of them. Presumably also you've put these data points together because they add layers of complexity and meaning to each other. That's why they're not standing alone. So I think it's also important, obviously, to keep colors and formats similar and consistent across the dashboard. So if blue means DC in one chart, it means DC in every single chart, so that the viewer doesn't have to, again, have that cognitive effort go into, all right, what am I seeing? That blue I assume is DC because I saw blue was DC earlier. Just keeping the effort on the viewer very low. And that way they can spend more time actually thinking about the conclusions of your data. Number 2, I would say a dashboard has to include the right data, which, right? But this is really key. I want the dashboard to tell a story, to tell a narrative that I think is interesting, and I want to curate the data so that the right conclusions are reached. This is kind of what Department of Commerce guy was talking about earlier. So if I want to show the change over time, I show percentage change in a time series. If personal income in DC went up from 49 billion to 51 billion last quarter, I don't care. That doesn't mean anything to me. A difference of $2 billion, like, that's huge, but how huge is it? Is that big? Is it good? Instead, I'd show the growth rate compared to the US, because we're more interested actually in whether we're sustaining a high growth rate of income in DC. or comparing it to population so that we can see the per capita growth in income? Those are questions that I'm more interested in. If I want people to understand and be surprised about, say, the level of affordable housing that's being created in DC, I'll give comparison points for context compared to other cities, other states. I want a non-expert to come to the right conclusions immediately, so I label things. I've seen a lot of graphs today, and obviously this is not knocking anyone else because they're being used for different things, with no labels on the axes. Like, I don't know what that graph says. And neither would anyone else who's just looking at it for the first time. It does take an incredibly long amount of time at the beginning to choose and curate the right data and the right way to present it. And then one last thing, I think there's a really hard temptation to fight to put in the dashboard data that is easily accessible or data that updates frequently. Because if your data updates frequently, you feel like you're providing a better service. You're providing a real-time look into this data, and you feel useful. You have more to say about stuff. It's a good feeling. But then there's kind of a pitfall of turning into the drunk guy you see on the sidewalk looking for his keys. You know that story? You come up, you find this guy shuffling around the sidewalk at midnight. You say, what are you doing? He goes, oh, I'm looking for my keys. You say, oh, did you lose them here? He's like, no. You're like, oh, why are you looking here? He's like, well, this is where the light is. So don't just use data that's where the light is. Use data that answers the problem, the questions you actually want answered. And then into more how you use and curate the data. Like I was saying, it's helpful to start by answering kind of the audience's FAQs. Not necessarily so that they can go there as like a one-stop shop to find the answers, but also for yourself to be able to answer them more easily and have that data right there for you. And then lastly, it's not, I don't think a dashboard should be a substitute for deep analysis. It's not going to show every answer every time to any data question you're going to have, or a question about the economy in my case. I think it's more of an invitation to think of more questions, think of better questions about when you see changes that are worrisome. And then that kind of hits on my earlier point about not getting too complicated with what you're showing. Show kind of the bare minimum for the quick understanding, and then deep dives elsewhere, you know. So then I want to talk about also who dashboards are for, kind of building off of the question I asked of the room, and then that feeling of being useful too when you're making a dashboard. Thinking about the audience is one of the most important things for me, because my job isn't just to monitor data or use data, but it's to get the right facts into the right people's hands at the right time too. So thinking about how people interact with data and visualizations and what I'm saying is really the key. I think for the audience, a dashboard is useful for two things. For one, initial context setting. So the first time you see the dashboard, you're like, huh, okay, I didn't know that. So for example, does anyone want to guess what the current unemployment rate in DC is? Throw out a guess. 7%. 7%, all right. Anyone else? 10? All right, 7 and 10. It's actually 6, so better news. It's good. At least you were right order of magnitude. That's good. And in the U.S. right now, it's 5%, so we're still higher than the U.S., but we're lower than we were. January 2015, it was 7.4%, so made some progress. But that kind of thing, like those key numbers that as maybe a policymaker you want to know right off the bat, off the top of your head, it's level setting. It's showing you the basic order of magnitude of things that you kind of need to know. And then after that, it's a quick reference, because if you know that that's where you can find the most up-to-date information on the unemployment rate because you're giving a speech later today, then the dashboard is there for a resource. But those, I think, are the only uses for the audience for a dashboard. It's really, and I think this is kind of an unpopular opinion, the dashboard is not for the audience, it's for me. it's for me to be able to have a standard way of thinking about the key things that I need to think about daily or weekly or monthly. And it's for me to be able to not spend time gathering data, but to have it all there in front of me so I can get those key points and deliver them. And it's not always going to be in pictures. A lot of people I work with don't think about things in pictures. They're policy people, they're lawyers, they think about things in words. And in order to compete with all these other sources of data coming in, newspaper articles, anecdotes from people they talk to, I need to sometimes say things 3 or 4 times, which is not a knock against them. That's just how you get your story to stick. It's also, a dashboard is kind of a forcing mechanism for me to have that library at my fingertips of data that I want to use and data that's trustworthy daily. So kind of a build it once, have it there to come back to and layer other things onto kind of resource. So that's really for me the conditions under which a dashboard works and the kind of understanding I have going into it that not a lot of people are going to use it and play with it. The people who would go into a dashboard and look at how every piece of data has changed weekly or monthly, they're probably going to go use the raw data themselves. That's kind of their interest. So that's the understanding I have, and I'm fine with it because it's useful for me. So I want to move now into why we're using Python in this case and what kind of problem my particular dashboard is solving. For economic data, there are a lot of different sources for data, and they update on different calendars, and they're in all sorts of different file types, PDFs, unfortunately. Forms, you have to fill out 3 pages worth of forms to get to an HTML table of data, which is, if anyone is from Census Bureau here, I would like to have a word. So this is just really time-consuming and energy-consuming. And my office, before we kind of set up this function, and I will say it's really less than 10% of my time is actual data science type work. I also have a lot of other things to do, so Python just made it quicker and easier. We were spending a lot of time answering requests from journalists, let's say, for data points that exist in open data. So part of the reason we created a public dashboard is for media and journalists to have kind of a curated list of what are the most trustworthy data sources that they can go to themselves and use too. And I think that's most of our regular user base. And here's our essential workflow right now. First, scraping data or accessing data with Python, reshaping it with Python, and a little bit in Tableau as well. I use Tableau Desktop for some reshaping and then all of the design for the visualizations we make, and I love Tableau. If anybody has questions about it or hates it, I'd love to chat. And then we host it right now on Tableau Public, which is less than optimal, and then embed the visualizations on a GitHub Pages site and then get feedback via GitHub and Twitter. And I will say, actually, we've gotten so many great suggestions and engagement from people on Twitter saying, oh, I really want to see this chart. And then we've actually put up then a little data blog of really quick hits on economic data in DC and other types of data in DC because we've gotten requests on Twitter, and that's kind of the most fun part of my job. Another way to do it would be to scrape and reshape in Python, design with D3, and then host everything on the web too. So that's what we're kind of flirting with moving to as well. I will say I would rather be using Tableau Server because then the whole process would be completely automated and hands-off for me because Tableau Server allows you to schedule data refreshes. And so I wouldn't have to, right now I have to manually push it to Tableau Public, which is unfortunate, but is the silver lining there is it's another forcing mechanism for me to look at the data and make sure everything is good as gold. Yeah?
Just a quick question. How do you leave the data and to import it into Tableau? Do you just move it to text files, or do you go off of like a database? Or?
Yeah, we have no data infrastructure. I just save all of my Python scraped data files into our network drive, and they all live in CSVs and Excel files.
Okay.
We're not using that much data. If we were, it would be probably not the way to do it for sure, but that's what we're doing, and it works right now. All right. So since every web scraper is its own little special snowflake, I'm not going to suggest tools to get the same thing done every time, because really you need to know the data that you're scraping to write the right scraper. But it is a really good forcing mechanism, and I think I've said that phrase a lot, but it is helpful to build a scraper because it makes you get to know your data really well from the beginning. And sometimes the fun part of it is that you find out things like when I'm scraping residential building permits from this census site, which again, if there's anyone here from census, I really apologize. This is the way I'm doing it. It's probably really expensive to you, but maybe you'll put it in an easier format. I haven't done it in a few months because they actually took down the site. Maybe it's my fault. I don't know. But you find out things like they've misspelled District of Columbia in the data, and that's why my code was breaking. Census Bureau.
I thought that's how you spelled it.
Do you work for Census? Is it you? Well, again, a word, please. Census Bureau. So yeah, that's kind of fun. But here are my little package of tools that I've used, a combination of these in every scraper I've made. And I really only have a dozen of them because I'm only using maybe a dozen open data sources from BLS, Bureau of Economic Analysis, FRED, the St. Louis Fed database of economic data is great. So I'll just go through these requests, of course. XLRD reads Excel files because sometimes data comes in just an Excel download from the web and I need to go in and reshape it. xlsxwriter writes Excel files, so does openpyxl. It's a little more powerful though, and it plays with pandas well. Pandas, of course, does everything. I use it mostly for reshaping because I'm doing my visuals in Tableau, and it's really a simple task that I need Python for. It's just getting the data and reshaping it. On the other side, JSON, various APIs that government agencies have developed, various wrappers make it a lot easier. Like I mentioned, the FRED API wrapper. And then config parser because I put most, if not all, of my scrapers online to hide my API keys. BeautifulSoup for parsing HTML. Luckily, I don't do a lot of that because that's more annoying. And in that Census Bureau example I showed, the difficulty there was you have to fill in a form for every month of data you want. Actually, no, you have to fill in 3 forms on 2 different web pages, and then the third gives you the data in an HTML table. So I stumbled upon Mechanize to emulate a browser so that I could fill in those forms, add choices to one of the forms because Washington, D.C. was missing, and then scrape the data. That came from a totally unrelated talk at the DC Hack and Tell. So I will say, in addition to just like listening to other people talk about Python, another great tool that is actually common to all the scrapers that I've made is this thing, which you may have heard of. That's the only common tool to all of these. And then another note about scraping incrementally versus pulling down the data, all the data that I need every time. I do feel a little bit bad that for a lot of them I'm pulling all the data over, but not that bad because economic data at least is frequently revised, and not just the previous month, like frequently found it to be incorrect or they changed the model for months, quarters, years back in the past. So this chart here, you're looking at the percent change in personal income in DC. And 2 weeks ago, it looked like the top chart. And then 1 week ago, they revised it really far back. So I would have, if I were scraping just the next date of data, I would have had a really weird jump in Q2 2016. But fortunately, I'm spending more of their resources and getting all the data every time. Just something to consider. It's also easier for me, so that's great. And I'm just going to quickly demo what product we've built here. It's really just kind of an interpretive layer on top of, okay, that's not going to work. An interpretive layer on top of data that's out there, open, anybody can use, but not everyone wants to. Here we go. So another thing is it doesn't look like a government site. Well, I hope not, because the rest of our government sites look like government sites. I think an important thing for interpreting the data is having a lot of white space. So really quick stats here. I will show this chart here. Average hourly wages of private sector jobs in DC. Starting in kind of mid-2015, started seeing the wages going down. At the peak, or I guess the trough of this weird phase here, wages were down 10% year over year, which is really big. And we were pretty confused about what was going on and how long this would last. And the key here, I think, going back to some other points I made earlier, is that this didn't answer any questions about why this was happening. Like, that's not the purpose of the dashboard. It led us to, A, tell people a lot. It took me maybe 5 months of saying wages are down, wages are down, wages are down every week until someone was like, oh, why? What's going on here? Do you have any hypotheses why? And I did, because I had been looking at it and formulating hypotheses and using other data to try to answer those questions. Turns out it kind of turned around lately, this spring. It's going the other direction. But DC was the only city besides some really energy-dependent cities in Texas where this was happening. So it was pretty worrisome. Turns out the most likely hypothesis, and we had a few economists weigh in on this, but not really do an in-depth look, is that we added a lot of hourly low-wage jobs in DC, restaurant jobs, service industry jobs, which is actually good news. That part of our economy is growing, and it was just kind of bringing down the average a bit. So that was something we were less worried about after we were able to look into a few possibilities. And just to do a quick intro here, none of this is really related to anything I'm web scraping, because it's internal data on what affordable housing we're creating in the district. As you may know, it's a very expensive city, and we're never going to have enough affordable housing, but we're actually, as a city, doing way more investment in affordable housing than any other city in the country, or any state, actually, than Florida. Florida is the only state that has a larger housing trust fund than we do. But we were able to get our data that we are producing with a lot of other agencies and put it out for the first time to the public here. And instead of putting out just rows and rows of project data, we did some visuals, which I think people connected with a lot more. Certainly journalists connected with more. And one of the good things about using Tableau is this can be shared and embedded anywhere else. And Greater Washington recently embedded this chart in one of their articles. And so the article will update as we update the data here, which I think is pretty cool. So just more to explore here. And I have here, we started also a little data blog to do, like, not really in-depth analyses, but quick hits, right? Here's some data, here's what it says, here's what's interesting about it. And here's an open invitation for any of you all, if you're working with data on DC, please get in touch with me so you can do a little guest post on our blog if you'd like to. We've had some folks from the civic hacking community do guest posts, folks from other DC agencies who are working with data that you might not always get to see because it's not public. They've done some guest posts, and down here you can subscribe for updates if you want to receive emails with our little data blog posts. And also, if you're a UXer, I would like to talk because I know this website isn't laid out or as user-friendly as it could be, because I'm not a UXer, and since my team is me, no one else is either in my office. So if you want to provide some public service, let's talk. All right. Any questions?
Just one other one, like where do you get either housing index or housing prices or any of that information?
There are a few sources for housing prices. We use Zillow data, which is not perfect, but has pretty good coverage in urban areas. If you're looking for housing prices in like rural Montana, I would say don't use Zillow, but probably there's not a lot of products for you anyway. Another housing index would be CoreLogic. We also post, I think, the Case-Shiller index, which is a little bit slower than others, but pretty rigorous as well. And then the FHFA or Fannie or Freddie, I forget which of those entities, also just recently came out with a new or improvements to their housing price index, which is based only on sales of houses which get Fannie or Freddie loans. So it's a really robust data set, but it has that limitation too. Zillow obviously tries to compute prices for all homes, not just recent sales. And I think depending on what you want, what coverage and universe you want to look into whether the housing price index that you're using is a repeat sales index, only using homes which have data points from sales recently and like tracking the same homes, or a oh my gosh, I'm going to forget the name of it, but a different model that uses the characteristics of the homes and doesn't necessarily track the same house over time, but imputes value from homes with similar characteristics selling.
Are they all free or easy to mine?
Some are not free because these companies have kind of cornered the public records markets to provide them as home price indices, basically, like CoreLogic. They publish their index in PDFs, which are really secure. So if you have an intern who likes typing, you could get that. The Case-Shiller is available on Fred. And oh yeah, the reason we're not posting that is because everything on our site is open license, but S&P owns the Case-Shiller index, and they haven't gotten back to me about allowing me to post it. So some are, some aren't.
Okay.
Zillow's is.
Zillow's?
They are. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
FHFA has no price index.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
What do you think of the data that's in PDF
Try not to use it. But if I need to, Tabula is a good tool. It's pretty manual still itself. If anybody has a great solution to making structured data out of machine-readable PDFs, please let me know, because I would love to. Sorry?
Is the PDF in structured format?
Some of them are, some of them aren't.
Because you can capture it like, the Clinical PDF. You can use the software called like Flexi Capture where it can read for you and capture that into a certain format.
Is it free?
No. There's hardly any software like that for free there.
Right.
The other thing it is you turn it into image and do OCR.
That's true. That's true. All right. Thanks. Thanks. Thanks, Room. Yeah.
So D3 versus Tableau, I'm a Tableau user.
Mhm.
But we're running up against the paywall. Those are internal data, and so as you get more and more licenses, just depending on context. For D3, are you thinking about like hand coding it or billing for something? Or?
Yeah, we've been slowly turning some of our visualizations into hand-coded D3 ones. It's slow because, like I said, this is really less than 10% of our time, and we're a 2-ish person team. So if you know anyone who is an intern and wants to do D3, I would love that. Yeah, it's more just like a resource and expertise kind of thing for us at this point. Yeah.
Have you ever had to deal with politics of you wanting to post some data or a visualization and other people in the government were not so thrilled with that idea? And how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, actually. When we set up the site, we were pretty clear that we were going to be conclusion agnostic about what we post. So I have a communications director who gets a little antsy sometimes, but I have to remind him, like, this is what you agreed to in the beginning. And I will say there's kind of a higher hurdle for things that we would post that have, like, negative conclusions on DC, not because we have a hesitance to post them, but more because we want to know what underlying causes there are more for those kinds of things. So we'll spend more time and do deeper dives on those, rather than just posting them and being like, we saw this thing, what's going on, we care about actually what we're putting out and what conclusions we're reaching. So that's maybe the only political consequence. Anyone else?
You said something about you embed the data on GitHub. What do you mean with that?
So this page lives on GitHub Pages, and I will say I forgot to mention it was based on the CFPB's Doctor template. And then Tableau provides embed codes to just put an iframe in the page, and that's what I meant. Anyone else? Yeah.
With the PDF query is good for parsing PDFs. When I say good, I don't mean
Magic.
nice.
Okay.
I mean it works.
That's good. Yeah, because I would really love to have some structured data that is from a lot of PDF forms that are the same. Thank you, PDF query. I'll write that down. Any other questions? Yeah.
With the census data, do you have like a particular API or?
I use the ACS API. It's really difficult to find the exact data point you're looking for because that page, their like data dictionary, so many rows that it often crashes my Google Chrome. It's just so many rows. But I'd say look up what data you need in the American Fact Finder and then just find those data points. That's really the biggest hurdle there. But I also have some scrapers online if you would like to see them. They're on my GitHub. Anyone else? Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for listening.